Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're just kind of waiting a couple minutes to see if other people come in, and then we will get started.
Hi, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our horse talk today. We'll be talking to Jen Britton today. I had the honor of meeting Jen at the Save Our Wild Horses conference this year, and she's been great at advocating with us for the wild horses at Theodore Roosevelt National Park and wild horses everywhere. So I am going to turn it over to Jen. Everybody is muted, and that's just out of respect for her, just so that people don't forget to mute themselves, and then we're all hearing everything that's happening at your house. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and Jen's going to do a presentation and kind of introduce herself, and then we will answer any questions afterwards. So thank you for being here, Jen, and I will turn it over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. Thanks so much for inviting me. And thanks for doing these horse talks and all of the advocacy that you're doing that is so effective. And thanks, everybody. I'm so glad that you're here today. So here's what I think I'm going to do today. I thought I would share how we social scientists read things like the National Park Service's environmental assessment for Theodore Roosevelt National Park, which proposes to remove the wild horses and offers some justifications. And I wanted to share this perspective because why is it important? Although it sometimes takes a while, academic research and scholarship does eventually impact public discourse. And right now, almost all of the scholarly research that is out there about modern living wild horses, which is tipped into a public discourse, comes mostly from rangeland management science that gets funded by public agencies, and all of it starts with a foundational assumption that wild horses are a problem to be solved. And questions are like, how do you remove them? Why can't we kill them? And things like that. I'm working with my husband, Christian Hunold, and our sort of ongoing project now is to deepen the research that comes from a position of support for wild horses. There's not a lot out there, although it's slowly growing. We cite Janaki Bhattacharya, who's based in Canada. She thinks about what labels like feral mean when they're applied to horses in the context of First Nations communities. Claudia Nutsky has investigated public perceptions of wild horses from a tourism perspective. And there's not a lot else besides them and us. And so what we kind of bring to the table of the public discourse about horses is analysis that takes into account values and politics that stakeholders bring to the space. And it can help us come at texts like the environmental assessment with a critical eye and some deep historical and political context. So got a bunch of slides. Look, I work in higher ed. We can hardly have coffee with each other without there being a PowerPoint presentation. So get ready. I got some slides for you. But first, sort of a little about me. I have a background in an academic field called Science, Technology, and Society, STS for short. I joke that we study scientists in their natural habitats. And what do I mean by that? We look at the claims that science and engineering practitioners make about their work. Often what they'll say is it's value neutral. Scientists are purely objective as thinkers. And we poke holes in those claims. And we argue that people engaging in the work of science, like rangeland management science and the field ecology that informs national park management, they bring their own cultural context to them to the job. And that always informs the science that they produce. This does not mean that we think science is junk, quite the contrary. We value science and we want to make it better. So that's my academic background. I'm a wild horse photographer, and I have photographed wild horses all over the US. I'm an admin with the Wild Horse Photography Collectives. Make sure you're following us. And with Christian, I'm a human animal studies scholar. Christian is my husband, by the way. My day job is at Drexel University here in Philly, where I am something called the Executive Director for Sustainable Development Strategy, which means I lead our institutional climate work and link that to how we do local economic development. So Christian and I live in Philly, here in the East Coast with our cats, and we ride bikes, and we watch a lot of Star Trek. All right, so just to quickly kind of share a little bit about the research that we've published so far. We started with a project about the Assateague Island ponies, and we looked at the political concept of borders and bordering. And one of our findings in that work is that the idea of wildness is not a fixed quality with a single meaning, and it's something that is negotiated. We moved from there to a sort of a look at the immobility of wild horses. We think of them as like roaming free, and everybody loves to repeat the phrase wild and free. And the reality is that they are pretty immobile. They cannot leave herd management areas. So we thought about that overlaid with the mobilities that are implied by climate change as water moves, as plant communities move. Earlier this year, I'm so proud of having the word poop in an article title in a serious academic journal. We published a look at kind of placemaking and how humans and burrows, wild burrows in a city called Moreno Valley, California, in Southern California, show us what thriving together could possibly look like in a multi-species community. And then finally, just last month, we did an article about wild horse roundups and the way that horses and ideas about horses, affect and emotion and ideas about gender all come together at the site of roundups. So that's what we do. So I'm going to go ahead and launch into a kind of a breakdown of two phrases that I pulled from the environmental assessment to just share with you a little bit, like in the nerd zone, how do we think about those? So here we go. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? Am I coming through, Chris? Awesome. All right, so okay, super. So the first phrase that I'm looking at comes from the sort of a preamble to the section about the feral horses, and it reads like this: the unowned, untamed bands of horses on the Great Plains are descended from domesticated horses. While these horses are often referred to as wild, the more appropriate designation of these horses is feral. A feral animal is one that was once domesticated, but has adjusted to surviving in a natural environment without human support. So I'm going to pull that apart, specifically the idea of feral and ferality. So the thing about the term feral is that it is not scientific. It is a political term, and it is about the question of who belongs and who doesn't belong. When I talked a little bit about what science, technology, and society as a field does, it reminds us that how we talk in science is never value neutral. And the term feral is a great example of this. How we talk about introduced species we always bring to it the social, political, and economic values that we have, our cultural worldviews. And that includes how we talk about feral things or invasive things or introduced things. My second point here is that the idea, so native as the kind of, what the Park Service thinks of as the positive counterpoint to feral, is kind of arbitrary. And it was a term developed that sort of came from the process of colonial exploration. Essentially, like these white guys rolling around the globe would get off their boats and look around at the species that they saw, and they thought, what is here is native. They didn't ask, like, what animals were coming and going before I got here. It's just what I see is native, and whatever arrives after my visit is introduced or invasive or doesn't belong. And the thing about these labels is that they obscure some really important things. Sometimes introduced species bring a lot of value. I mean, when we think about horses, think about how they became so integral to indigenous communities. And in many ways, they become embedded in human cultures. They don't always. Sometimes they are damaging, right? But that is not routinely the case. When scientific institutions kind of use these labels, what they're doing is that they are rejecting any kind of process of engaging or even recognizing and acknowledging any sort of cultural legacies or cultural values that make species like wild horses in North America an important part of existing cultures. And it means that they're throwing out those cultural values. And so we come to the question, who decides who belongs and who doesn't? Which is a social science question. And you can kind of frame it as, how do we know things? And not only how do we know things, but whose knowledge about things actually matters and gets paid attention to. And this is called epistemology. It's just kind of the fancy word for asking, how do we know things? So where does the National Park Service get its knowledge about ecosystems? That comes from scientific research institutions in North America and Europe. It is traditionally white dominated, traditionally male dominated, and it always sees itself as uniquely rational, sort of rational above all other thinkers about ecosystems. And like I already mentioned when I was discussing the sort of how we got the term feral and sort of, or native, right? So the roots of the idea of being native. This profession of field ecology research has its deepest roots in these kind of colonial exploration practices. This science thinks about species, right? When its concern for non-human animals is about populations and species. It is mostly kind of uninterested in the experience of individuals. If they are, it's only to the extent that it informs science about whole species and whole populations. But, I always want to offer the reminder that, again, this doesn't mean that science is garbage, right? Science is a process. It is a conversation between scholars. But the thing about science is it always is revising itself. And, what Chris and I are kind of arguing about this type of field ecology, rangeland management science is that it kind of is resisting self-reflection and the kind of reflexive self-critical growth that you'd kind of want to see as new scientific discoveries come on board all the time, especially about wild horses in North America. In this framing of sort of the professionally university trained field ecologist, knowledge that, for example, indigenous communities have formed about horses gets completely disregarded because folks in those communities do not have that same professional training for the most part. So like, we're going to trash that knowledge. Wild horse advocates who often are spending hours and hours in the field staring at horses and watching them do things and learning about them. We also are not seen as legitimate holders of knowledge about wild horses, because maybe we don't have credentials. What we know is anecdote, it's sentimentality. And the term for when structures that hold power dismiss the capacity of those with less power to create knowledge is called epistemic injustice. All right, I just threw a lot at you with that slide. So that was my kind of assessment of that first phrase. That was this, right? The idea of ferality. Where did I get to? I was here. So I'm coming next to this second statement that I'm going to parse with you. Has three parts to it that I'm going to pull apart. The purpose of the proposed action is to address livestock, horse and cattle herds within the park under relevant laws, regulations, policies, and management priorities, including the conservation of native species and natural prairie ecosystem functions. And that is a Star Trek double face palm for you. All right. I think, whoops, sorry, I flubbed my screen share a little bit. Let me make that a little bit bigger. There we come on, MacBook. Okay, close enough. Now I'm gonna pull that up a little bit more. Better. Okay, so that first chunk, the purpose of the proposed action is to address livestock within the park under relevant laws, regulations, policies, and management priorities. This is a bunch of bureaucraties, and this is about regulatory authority. And it reminds us that everybody who lives in the park, every non-human animal species, has to bend to the will of this regulatory authority. It's 2023. There kind of are not really any wildlife populations that are not managed in some way. The idea that wildlife is just left to its own devices is sort of in our imagination. I think about examples like the National Elk Range, where wild elk get fed all winter. I think about the state of Arizona, which has basically been airdropping water to the wildlife in its state so that it survives the mega drought. I think about the ways we just kill millions of coyotes every year by the USDA to serve farmers and ranchers. So wildlife is managed, and this statement reminds us of that. Who is the authority? That's the Park Service personnel, and remember where their knowledge claims are coming from. It's conveyed by the traditional conservation science that I just described. Here's where this really matters. That kind of regulatory authority gets to decide who belongs and who doesn't belong. And this matters, right? This category matters because if it decides you belong, you're good, you get to stay. If it decides you're feral or you're not native, you're then subject to what they kind of euphemistically called management actions. All right, the second part of that phrase, including the conservation of native species. And I want to tackle, kind of come back to the idea of native, which kind of often goes hand in hand, obviously, with feral. And I want to say when regulatory authority focuses on the question of what's native and what's not, that's a really narrow conception of belonging and not belonging. I talked a little bit earlier in a few slides ago about where that idea of native even comes from, and it just in this framing means that native is what white explorers saw the first time they went out. Period. and the timing of it is arbitrary. When these kinds of decisions about who is native and who is not are emphasized, what gets missed are some really important things. It's cultural significance, as well as new forms of ecological value, right? Like, think about it, you don't have to work very hard to think about the meaning of something like wild horses in the US. Another example of ecological value and kind of novel forms of that, when you think about wild camels, and the biggest population of wild camels is in Australia, where they are an introduced species, and they barely exist in their home territory in Central Asia. So there's kind of a value there that wild camels exist because they were introduced somewhere else and they have not become extinct. Another point I want to make about sort of conserving native systems is the kind of futility of that in a globalized world. There is no ecosystem on our planet that is kind of undamaged or unharmed by human industrial development. I think, like, earlier this week, we heard that there are microplastics in clouds. There is no pure ecosystem. And so what does it even mean to recapture that? And I always liken that to stuffing toothpaste back in the tube, which is hence my toothpaste image here. So, like, what does it even mean to, it just seems like a weird exercise to recapture and rebuild something that you have decided is native. But once that is done, the next question is, what happens to you if you have been judged to not be native? Well, that's where those management actions come in. That this kind of thinking leads to a concept that we call massification. Massification, kind of, if you kind of look at that word, it's a way of thinking about living things as an undifferentiated mass. Along with massification, you get detainability, killability, and the status is derived from that practice of ecological science that emphasizes native and not native status. Massification is about understanding populations as a whole rather than as a set of unique individuals. It doesn't, as a general rule, recognize individual dynamics, family dynamics, but if it does, it kind of wants to break them up. And it cannot recognize, like, Teton could walk past massification and it wouldn't know who that is. An example of how we get policy from massification is that deer are dangerous on highways, we need to cull, right? So that's a sort of an assessment about a population that from which you derive a decision that there are too many, they are in the wrong place, which is to say the roadways, and the solution is to kill, right? To kill en masse. Massification is not just applied to unwanted animals, it is also applied to unwanted groups of people who are likewise seen as undifferentiated, usually large groups, right? What drives massification is a fear of numbers. Illegals, the poor. In wild horse language, you'll hear the Bureau of Land Management when they talk about numbers of horses on public land, they will cite things like they're growing at 20% a year, and sometimes their numbers make you think the stallions must be giving birth to foals as well, with the numbers that they're talking about, sort of that are kind of scare numbers. If present trends continue is a phrase that often comes along with massification. it enables, so the idea of massification, the sort of logical step is that you got to put stuff in jail, you got to put it in pens, or you got to kill it. And that is where we get Bureau of Land Management holding pens that I'm showing you on the side of the slide here is the Rock Springs, Wyoming holding. So detention and killing are a bureaucratic management tool. So pushing back on that is an academic field that is called human animal studies, and that's kind of the framework in which Christian and I are publishing our social sciences work on wild horses. Excuse me. In human animal studies, the focus isn't on kind of the biology of the whole population or the evolutionary history of the population. What human animal studies elevates is a look at relationships, political relationships, economic, cultural relationships between humans and animals in all kinds of settings. That includes wild horses, but it also includes thinking about our relationship with our pets, with agricultural animals, with biomedical research. There's amazing work on rats by a buddy of ours, Rafi Youat, who thought about rats and the different ways that rats are important in human culture. We experiment on them, right? They're stand-ins for humans. They are pets, they are adorable little beady-eyed pets, but also they're pests, right? And so we try to kill them en masse. And human animal studies shows us how complicated those identities and those relationships can be. Human animal studies rejects the idea of human exceptionalism, right? That's the idea that's where you get notions like only humans have emotions, only humans use tools, only humans have language, or politics, or only humans grieve. I think about the work of, some of you may know of the primatologist Frans de Waal. In his research, and he just reminds us, his and other research over the past couple of decades, the borders that we thought traditionally have separated humans from animals are evaporating all the time. As we learn more and more about the capabilities of non-human animals. Human animal studies politicizes things that we do to exploit or harm animals. There is some overlap with ideas from animal rights and animal liberation activism. And the really interesting thing and the fun thing about working in this space is that it asks interesting questions about how we can flourish together in multi-species communities, rather than does it belong and how do we get rid of it, which is the question that traditional field ecology is so frequently asking. Bottom line in human animal studies is that it affirms our relationships with animals is worth protecting, and that individual animals and animal families are living lives that deserve to be honored. So human animal studies, and I'm going to go in a minute into another field called compassionate conservation, are both ways of pushing back against those scientific ideas that drive massification and removals and killing of unwanted animals. All right, the third part of that phrase, the third part of the second phrase, if you're following, and natural prairie ecosystems. Social scientists are going to ask, what does that even mean to be natural in the Anthropocene? As I already mentioned, there are no pure ecosystems that are unaffected and sort of pure and natural. Like, it just doesn't exist. Everything has been changed by industrial development, pollution, climate change, human presence. And it is just that nature is in flux. Ecosystems are always in flux. And I always want to sort of hasten to add, it doesn't mean that our current state of flux is necessarily good. But just to say that the attempt to sort of find one moment in time and call that natural is an arbitrary political choice. Remember, that is driven by the activity of colonial explorers. I think about Ross McPhee, who reminds us that horses co-evolved with North American grasslands. Indigenous scholars who are thinking about the animals embedded and entangled with their cultures will tell us that they consider horses to always have been in North America, that they did not go extinct 5 to 10,000 years ago. In human animal studies and in the compassionate conservation work that I'm going to describe next, we do not reject that information. We take it on board to say that wild horses have ecological value, they have cultural value, and yeah, we're going to manage them because all wildlife populations are managed. But to do that, we need to engage a set of stakeholders who care about all of those factors. All right. This is taking less time, Chris, than I thought. I was like really afraid that I was going to like ramble on for 4 hours, but I'm like making good progress here. I hope everybody is still with us.
Yep, we're all still here. You're doing a great job. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. I mentioned compassionate conservation. This it's a kind of a movement. It's a new practice of conservation science. So think about sort of folks who are in those traditional conservation training programs at universities. And in a lot of cases, they're looking around and going, our science practice today is to kill 10,000 frogs. This is not feeling good. Or to make a plan to kill all of the raccoons in this square mile, right? And so this approach is another reaction to the killing as a tool that comes out of traditional conservation science. The scientists who have taken on this project of developing compassionate conservation as a practice are doing things like drawing our attention to those shortcomings, and they are arguing that we should respect all organisms, no matter that they're native or not, that all animals deserve our care and compassion. And you know what? If we have to remove them to do it humanely, all organisms deserve our moral concern, no matter where they live. They criticize those kind of political notions that get you to practices for massification and this whole population approach that makes individuals invisible. And they challenge the practices of killing to protect, essentially. So that was, so that sort of wraps up my kind of social science breakdown of those 2 phrases from the environmental assessment. I wanted to change hats just really briefly. You know, my specialization in science, technology and society is history. So I am an actual credentialed historian. And so wearing that hat, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history and identity of our national parks. There's this notion that parks will promote about themselves. And it's easy to kind of fall into this, that our national parks are places of untrammeled nature, sort of pure nature and ecological purity. There's no human culture here, right? This just represents the bison and the wolves and the bears. This is just pure nature. And I am here to puncture that balloon and say that is it's just a lie. It's an illusion. That that sort of idea about national parks insists that you forget that people lived in those places before they became parks. Right. So first we forcibly removed and murdered human communities from the land that is the US, and in some cases is now a national park. But in some cases, like in the earliest national parks, there were still people, like there still were some indigenous communities still in those spaces. I'm thinking of like Yellowstone, Glacier, I think Yosemite was part of this. When, and Teddy Roosevelt was complicit in this as well. When the folks making parks looked at that and said, well, this can't be ecologically pure if there are humans here, they literally evicted indigenous communities so that they could create a national park and call it pure ecology, right? So, hey, that's where national parks comes from. I love national parks, and this is a really awkward fact of their history. They are spectacular places, right? Again, I love being in national parks. They protect ecosystems, they protect endangered species, but the idea that they are natural is totally imaginary. To believe that they're natural means that you have to erase the history and the present of indigenous human communities in these spaces. This month, the National Park System is celebrating Indigenous History Month, right? So they're like celebrating, and they'll share pictures of like moccasins and teepees, and they will never name the actual communities that were evicted to create those parks. So it's a little bit of, I would say, inch deep lip service. Since humans arrived in North America, we have been part of the nature here, right? The landscape of North America has been, I don't know when did humans arrive? Is it 30,000 years ago? I'm embarrassed that I forget that number. But since that time, North America has been a place of hybrid ecologies that didn't just house interesting animal species, but also housed human industry, culture, and activity. Human activity has always been, since humans have arrived, human activity and culture has been entangled with our ecologies. And the idea that parks want to pull these things apart is, as we say, it's politics dressed up as science. The composition of species that are allowed to be in national parks is always a political decision. It doesn't have a lot to do with nature or ecology. So that is my little walk through some of the things that go through a social scientist's head when they read things and texts like the Theodore Roosevelt National Park's environmental assessment. I just threw a lot at you, and so I thought I would provide a little bit of a summary in terms of a few ideas that you could potentially tip into your submission to the environmental assessment. I hope everyone has done it already. If you've done it already, do it again. If you haven't, hop to. Make sure to check Chris's, the Chasing Horses, Wild Horse Advocates website for just spectacularly useful ideas. But if you wanted to juice up your letter with some social science, here's some ideas that you could throw on board. Emphasizing that wild horses have important cultural significance. The phrase to various publics just means like, it's a fancy way of saying to lots of people. They are important to indigenous communities. They're important to us. You know what? They're important to women. Women really care a lot about wild horses. The sort of gender breakdown of wild horse advocates is something like 99% women, as far as I can tell. And in none of these publics do they care about the question of, are they feral or are they not? It just is irrelevant. Another point is that is sort of pushing against massification. We can see wild horse families and dynamic relationships playing out in front of our eyes. They are not disposable. They're not undifferentiated populations. When somebody can walk into this national park and, and sort of name the horses, that is really significant. And, that something important is lost when that's removed. And also, since I've walked you through some of the background to some of this science, if we're going to say that science matters, how about looking at more than one scientific assessment? The park has only considered one scientific perspective. And it happens to be the one that supports removal. They've disregarded other scientific opinions. And then finally, my bread and butter in my day job is deliberative process. And the reason for that is that it's really effective. When you are making a big change in an institution, you're doing something new that has important value. The way to do that is to do a deliberative process. That means taking a bunch of time, pulling a bunch of different people together, and hashing it out, finding the commonalities and finding a consensus around how you can value, all of the priorities that are at stake. And so the park has not done this, right? They'll say that they've done a community outreach process, but that just amounted to we're going to have an hour-long meeting and disregard most of your questions. But we can say that we had this meeting. So that is where I'm going to leave it. If you're still here, bless you. That was a lot. But I want to say thanks again for coming and supporting the horses. And I guess I can shut my mouth for a minute, Chris, if folks have any questions.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was great. I appreciate all the help you and everybody else have given, because a lot of people have said when they go back and look at these videos, it's really helped them write their comment letter on the draft environmental assessment. So thank you. And you gave a lot of different perspectives. One thing I did want to talk about was what you were talking about with the national parks. And I think that we do take that for granted. And I just actually was introduced to a book that I'm going to read after this week is over, called Building the National Parks. So yeah, there were actual architects that built national parks. And yeah, we don't think about that. Like we just go in and ooh and ah the wonder, but we don't think about like how somebody really thought about that overlook and thought about where the road should be and things like that. So yeah, it's just fascinating. So the more and more I dig into this, I learn something new all the time. And I think that that's great. And I keep telling people educated advocates are what we're looking for, because you're the ones who are going to make the most impactful comments. So does anybody have any questions for Jen? She's got a variety of, this is why I never know how to introduce you to anything, because you wear so many different hats and you've got so many different specialties. But she can answer anything that you need to have answered, I think.
Yeah. So well, I don't want to go that far, Chris.
Just people are saying this has been an awesome presentation. I'd love to know how us horse advocates can engage Congress to pay attention to us 99% who are wanting changes.
So, Chris and I thought about this in our last paper. So consistently, we see when we think about kind of wild horses in the Bureau of Land Management managed spaces, that the agency and the scientists who inform the agency are kind of locked in a belief system that says that wild horses are dangerous and don't belong, and also that wild horse advocates are dangerous, hysterical, and don't belong. And they are working really hard to discredit. And sometimes our impulse is to think, well, what if I seem less emotional? And we don't think that is necessarily the way to go, that really embracing the affection that we have for horses, that they're culturally important to us, can be very powerful. And I think about Ashley Avis's film that's just out now. I hope you've all checked it out. It just really captures that, right? The importance of having these beings in our culture. I think that's part of it, and sort of conveying those ideas. I mean, and let's be really clear. I think Heather Hellier is also with Save Our Wild Horses. I think that what she says with sharing, repeatedly sharing information about taxpayer waste, like there are a lot of Congress people for whom that's really important, and bringing up the waste that happens when we are removing horses from land that the BLM's own data says has been degraded by livestock grazing, in order to make room for more livestock grazing at pennies on the dollar, right? Where basically like livestock grazing is happening at a loss to the US taxpayer. So I think that's also useful. But above all, it's movement building. And getting more people into this movement by reaching out and finding commonalities with other kinds of advocacy. And I don't think that needs to be limited just to other nature and wildlife advocacy. Like, as I mentioned, and I've said it before, we have a case to make about climate change. We have a case to make about unwanted beings, right? Detainability and killability. And so anywhere I think this movement can make connections and kind of, create a snowball with more and more folks joining hands is going to be really important, because the movement is kind of small right now.
And I think that that's important. And I think that that's something that we've seen throughout North Dakota. It's just not wild horse advocates that are now advocating for the horses here. It's, I mean, even the Stockmen's Association in North Dakota is advocating for the horses to stay. Politics is advocating for the horses to stay. Tourism is. So, yeah, I think that that's a very good point. And something that's, I mean, when you read the environmental assessment that the park gave out, it doesn't seem like it's working, but I mean, there's really, I don't want to say like an us versus them, but that's kind of the situation that they've created, and it's a lot of us versus just that part. So it's exhausting too.
That coalition has been so powerful, Chris.
So persistence is definitely something. Maybe while we're seeing if anybody else has any questions, something that I know that I would be interested in hearing you talk a little bit about. And I know you have reservations, so I don't want to push your buttons, but can you talk about Assateague? Because that comes up a lot when we talk about the Theodore Roosevelt horses.
And I'm sorry, I told you I would have a slide on Assateague, and then I flaked because it's been a busy week. I'll share a little bit about Assateague. Like, Assateague is sort of my home herd. I'm just a 3-hour drive away from there. And I've been a volunteer for Assateague Island Alliance, which is the Friend of the Parks nonprofit. And I created field guide to those ponies. So like every single pony in the herd has a picture and a guide. The sort of the question of horses and ponies in other national parks is really interesting until this year, until the Teddy Park came out to say like horses don't belong. I thought that horses in national parks were safe. At Assateague, I think as much as anywhere, maybe more than anywhere, that pony herd is so embedded in local culture, right? So like pictures of the ponies appear in, the local chamber of commerce and, sort of tourist agencies. They end up as sort of helping identify local businesses. And they just like people come to Assateague Island because it is a beautiful beach that is in driving distance of this East Coast megalopolis, right? From New York to Washington, D.C. And people do just come for the beach, but people also come there for the beach that has ponies on it, right? And so, but at the same time, like I'm constantly hearing language coming out of the Park Service personnel there about that you hear the massification in it, right? They're deeply uncomfortable referring to the ponies by name and would prefer to just use their alphanumeric designation. They fuss openly about humanizing the ponies, is how they call it. Like, if you give them names, then I don't know, they're going to get driver's licenses next or something like that. Right. So rather than sort of referring to Susie Soleil, they'll refer to the mare N2BHS-M, right? Right, to sort of really depersonalize that. So it's a weird balance, and there's a real tension on Assateague Island in terms of like an understanding that the ponies are both deeply embedded in regional culture, right? And cultural preservation is one of the purposes of national park systems, but also like there are legitimate concerns about these big roaming ungulates on a really pretty delicate barrier island system. Ponies did not co-evolve with barrier islands the way they did with our Midwestern and Western grasslands, right? So like some legitimate questions there about how many can the island really support. So it's a delicate balance there, I would say. The numbers are managed with PZP darting. This is the first herd in the US that was managed with PZP. If folks don't know what that, I'm sure most folks here know what that is, but just to be sure, porcine it is a hormonal contraceptive derived from I don't know, like pig hormones or something, right? But it is a contraceptive, an immunocontraceptive, so it acts on immune systems rather than being hormonal, and it can be used on deer as well as horses, basically ungulates, right? And so Assateague was the pioneer for using this, and we learned a lot about the sort of the downsides and the upsides of PZP management. And based on what I've witnessed there, I still believe in PZP. I just think it just needs to be used with care. And the other national park property that I visit that has wild horses is the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. That's another Midwestern wild horse herd. They, in the 90s, the Park Service there, in a remarkably similar stories, said that, hey, there are these wild horses roaming around this park, and they are not native, and they're damaging because they're invasive, and we're going to take them all out. And they ran up against residents of the region for whom the horses were an incredibly important historical and cultural asset. Those horses had been free in the Ozarks for about the past 100 years. During the Great Depression, as you know, as folks were unable to care for their horses, sort of turned a bunch of them loose. I mean, certainly there would have been some free range grazing on top of that. But so, you know, when we got to the 90s, as of the 90s, the horses had been there for at least like 60, 70 years. And suddenly the Park Service was going to toss them out. The Missouri Wild Horse League was formed out of that effort. They succeeded in getting federal protection and legislation for that herd of horses. And I think that's a really instructive example. There is a compromise, right? The numbers are limited to about 50-ish. And so each year, you know, a couple of younger horses are pulled, and they all end up in, you know, pretty good local adoption homes. A friend of mine has one of them. And so that too, right, and in the Ozark National Scenic Riverways is another example of a kind of uneasy compromise that's been forged based on the cultural value of those horses.
So I think that an important thing to note is that as far as the National Park Service goes, and I know a lot of people talk about the BLM. The BLM and the National Park Service are both under the umbrella of the Department of the Interior. So there are a lot of similarities.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of times that we think the Park Service is, taking a page out of the BLM book, and
Mhm.
it makes sense. But there is no concerted effort to remove wild horses from all national parks, which I think pokes the biggest holes in any of the management policy things that
Yeah.
they cite. So, and I also know too, because the question of, are they getting rid of the horses at Assateague if they're getting rid of them at Theodore Roosevelt National Park? And when we ask that to the park staff here,
Mm.
they say, well, we can't speak to that management. And I talked to your chief resource manager, Bill Huxlander, is that his name? Something like that.
Something like that.
Something like that. Sorry, Bill, if you're watching and I butchered your last name. Um, but I asked him because I've talked to him before and he seems very transparent. I appreciate what you said. It seems like the attitude toward horses is something that's universal through the National Park Service. Because we get the same thing here, about horses don't have feelings, don't put your human
Mhm.
emotion into them,
Mhm.
and let's just call them numbers because that's a lot easier and it doesn't give you the warm fuzzy feeling like, hey, look, it's Boomer. But I did ask him if they were getting rid of the horses at Assateague, and he said, no, we don't consider them livestock. They're a
Right.
cultural resource. And that's a big point that our lawyers have brought up time and time again in our letter. We've been asking the park for the documentation showing when they classified the horses as livestock or whatever they
Yeah.
classified them
Yeah.
as. And they have yet to produce that document. So if that document existed, they would
Mhm.
they would give that
Mhm.
up because then that would,
Right. Right.
end that argument. So they have not properly classified the horses in a way that
Mhm.
they should have according to National Park Service policy. And there's no concerted effort, like you said, whether they're because the Assateague Island horses are not protected by federal law either, correct? So they're not
That's
trying to get.
the No, you're correct. Yeah. They were when that park was created in 1965, they were just kind of there. And the superintendent of the park was like, hey, look, it's unique wildlife. We're going to call them wildlife. So they are managed as wildlife, but they do not have federal protection. I mean, the Theodore Roosevelt Park experience just makes me less confident that they're safe at Assateague too. I don't think they're going to go anywhere in the next year, obviously, but like I no longer assume that they are really secure there. I went to Sable Island for the first time this year. And one of the things that I learned that I think is also really instructive is that when Parks Canada in 2013 turned Sable Island into a national park reserve, right? The horses were there and they asked the Canadian public what they think of the horses. And the Canadians are overwhelmingly in support of keeping the wild horses on Sable Island. And the regulatory decision that got made was to designate those wild horses as what they call naturalized wildlife. So it's almost like they have a green card, or like the next step beyond an American green card, right? It was sort of naturalized citizenship that confers on them the status of other kinds of wildlife. And I thought that was a great example of how regulation and bureaucracy can be wielded in protection of horses.
It's
But
something that
again, like they did. So go ahead, Chris.
that's something that Ross McPhee had said when we did our horse talk with him is, at what point do we give wild horses their green card? Like when have
Yeah.
they earned
Mm-hmm.
their
Mm-hmm.
native papers here so that we don't
Yeah.
have to keep going through this. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a really
Yeah.
good.
So I see that Julie has a question, or Joanne. Hi, Joanne. What science can we present to pick apart arbitrary appropriate management levels and genetic diversity? Science should be science, yet the BLM doesn't want to listen to these results. Yes, that's correct. Peer is a great organization. Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, just an amazing organization. So that's the thing, Joanne, that science doesn't exist. It's not funded. The science that takes a new look at appropriate management levels on public land hasn't happened, right? So it's not there. And what we do have is the argument from the National Academies of Science from 10 years ago that says these AMLs are trash. BLM, you did not do a scientific process, but that's all we've got right now, and that's an argument that's 10 or more years old at this point. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I got nothing to pull out of my hat for that one, but I do think that Western Watersheds provides some great, when we're talking about Bureau of Land Management managed herds, I think Western Watersheds and Scott Beckstead have some great resources. And just kind of arguments that you can make, especially where the BLM's own data is concerned, in which something like 50% of BLM managed land that has cattle and sheep grazing fails the BLM's own standards for ecological health. And horses aren't even there in most of those spaces, right? So they will still blame horses that don't even live within 200 miles of a space that is failing environmental health standards. So I think that's probably the best source for those kinds of arguments.
I think
so. Make sure
too,
you're following Western Watersheds.
Right, and when you're talking about science, a lot of times, and we've seen this even throughout the Theodore Roosevelt draft EA, the data that they're using is not the most current data, it's the data that fits their narrative. So making sure that you're taking part in comment periods and using the best science and bringing that up, I think is important. And it also gets hard, I know, while all this has been going on with the Theodore Roosevelt horses, and so this is where my attention is focused, we have the whole thing going with the McCullough Peaks horses and, the Department of Interior, so BLM, Park Service, all drops their draft environmental assessments or their plans all at the same time, so that we're all scurrying to save, the one herd that we're fighting hardest for, and we can all kind of come together. And I think that it's intentional. I believe that's an entirely intentional strategy, but it keeps us from pulling together the way that we need to.
Yeah. Julie also had a question about publications. Julie, I am gonna shortcut this, and I'm putting a link to my ResearchGate profile here in the chat. ResearchGate is kind of like social media for academic research. And that's got full text links to all of our papers. You can even read my paper about Drexel using its food service provider Airmark to multiply our civic engagement mission if you wanted to do that. So all my papers are on there. So feel free to dive in there.
Can you send that to me through Messenger too? Then I'll put it in our YouTube
for sure
channel so that people can see that there too.
Yeah. Any other questions?
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. Cool. I do want to remind you that Monday we will be having a horse talk with Dr. Castle McLaughlin, who's on this call too. So
hi, Castle. I want to be there. I'm so happy to hear that. I'm really interested in hearing.
So we will be doing that on Monday, and please get your comment letters into the park. We have a form letter on our website. We have resources that you can use. We have talking points. We have blogs that have, I feel like, beaten to death different topics and different arguments, and really kind of tried to explain to give everyone, tools that they can use to make their best comment letter. And as Jen said, if you already sent in a comment and you think of something, or Jen brought something up today and you're like, hey, I wish that I sent that in, send it in. Nobody says that you have to just send in one comment letter. So I do recommend that I've asked people to just kind of open a Word document and keep throwing your ideas in there and get them all together and send it once. But if you already sent them in and you have more to say, then say what you have to say. This is your one chance. So thank you again, Jen. I appreciate this very much. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thanks for organizing, Chris. Always ready to help you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.